This is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and in this video, I'd like to provide students who are getting started with Greek reading with some help working through this first lesson. It's important to know that students cannot get started with the Greek text without first having studied the guides that I published, which are at the top of the course page on the Study Center, which explain how to read the Greek alphabet, Greek breathing marks, accent marks, and so on. So if you haven't studied any of that, if you look at this text down here and really have no idea what this is, before you can get started in Greek reading, you need to go and study those preliminary videos to learn how to actually read the Greek letters and understand the symbols in the Greek language. So this lesson assumes you've already done that. This lesson assumes that if I ask you to read this text, while you might not understand the meaning of it, you would be able to actually read it. So if you can do that, you can look at this and say, oh yeah, I know these letters. I understand what all these marks mean. I can read this, but I need to learn what it means. Then you're ready for Greek reading. If you look at this and say, I have no idea what these letters are, what these symbols mean, then you have some preliminary work to do before we can get started. So having said that, I'd like to dig in here and begin our study of the first 5 verses of the Gospel of St. John. You can see the text here. Unfortunately, at the moment, it doesn't look very good. The font is quite small, but still big enough to read. But when we get down to the exposition and go through the individual verses, it's plenty large enough for us to see all the marks clearly and make good sense of it. So what I'd like to do to get started here is simply read these first 5 verses. I'd like to ask you to follow along, and this is a good opportunity for you to test your ability to read the Greek letters and syllables and accent marks and breathing marks. And like I said, if it's still very difficult for you, don't get ahead of yourself. Just keep working on those reading lessons. And once you're able to read the language itself, then join me for Latin reading expositions. So just follow along here and see how you do. Starting in verse 1. En arche ein ho logos, kai ho logos ein pros ton theon, kai theos ein ho logos, houtos ein en arche pros ton theon. Verse 3. Panta di autou egeneto, kai choris autou egeneto, ude hen ho gegonen. Verse 4. En auto zoe ein, kai he zoe ein to phos ton anthropon. Verse 5. Kai to phos en te scotia faine, kai he scotia auto ou katelaben. That's the Greek text for this first lesson, verses 1 through 5 of chapter 1 of the Gospel of St. John. And now what we're going to do is walk through each verse one word at a time. And you can see here I've got the exposition of every single word written out for you to study. But I'd like to walk through with a larger text here where you can see all the details, make sure the pronunciation of every word is clear, and then look at the meanings and understand the translation. So let's read together slowly and clearly verse 1 of the Greek text here. En, And you can see it's soft breathing, or no aspiration, with an uppercase epsilon and nu in this first word, N. Arche, arche. We see the alpha with no aspiration, with a soft breathing mark above it, then a rho, a key, and then the eta with a circumflex accent above it. That means that when we read that syllable, we accent rise and fall on that long vowel. You also see a mark underneath that vowel, which is the iota subscript, which means that there was a iota at the end of this word that's not pronounced, but it was recorded as a subscript just to mark its presence and not interfere with pronunciation. So we have arche. Notice that circumflex accent, arche, en arche. The next word, we have the eta, soft breathing with a circumflex accent on top. That means we're going to rise and fall in pitch or stress, however you'd like to accent the syllables. We're going to rise and fall on that syllable, and there's no breathing to be added. We have eta and nu. Ein, ein. You can hear my pitch rise and fall. Ein, ein. We then have the definite article with rough breathing. When you see this rough breathing mark, it's equivalent to adding an English letter H before the Greek vowel. So this is pronounced ho, ho. We have the omicron, the short O, so it should be a short sound, short in length. Ho, ho. We then have the lambda, omicron with an acute accent, which means we're going to rise on this syllable and fall back on this syllable. We have lambda, omicron, gamma, omicron, and then final sigma. Logos, logos. En arche, ein ho logos. We then have kappa followed by the diphthong alpha iota. Notice this has a grave accent, which means we pronounce this with a quiet tone or lower pitch. It's unstressed, unaccented. It's pronounced kai, kai. Notice the diphthong makes one syllable, kai. We then have the same phrase we saw here, ho logos, the rough breathing and omicron, ho logos. We then have the verb repeated here, ein, same verb we saw here, ein, ein. We then have P, Rho, Omicron, and final sigma with grave accent, pros, pros. We then have the article tau, Omicron, nu, ton, ton. We then have theta, epsilon, Omicron, nu, with an accent on the second syllable, theon, theon. That's an acute accent, a rise, theon. We then have kai again. We then have theos, 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 with grave accent, theos. We then have the verb again, ein, and the phrase ho logos, ho logos. So to read this verse, en arche ein ho logos, kai ho logos ein pros ton theon, kai theos ein ho logos. Now, we took a lot of time to work through that first reading, and we'll speed up as we go, but I want to make sure that that reading is coming along Well, because Greek has an entirely different alphabet. So we've got to make sure that all of that is clear, and the grammar depends upon the spelling. So we've got to be accurate. We can't be sloppy in our knowledge of the letters and sounds and pronunciation and so forth. So we'll go slow and then pick up speed as we gain accuracy over time. So let's now go and look at the exposition and learn the vocabulary. Remember, in Greek Reading 1, it's assumed that you are getting started with the study of Greek Grammar 1 as you're studying Greek Reading 1. So I'm not assuming that you know any grammar for the Greek language. And so our focus in Greek Reading 1 is going to be on building our vocabulary. We're just going to focus on building our vocabulary, and it's an important vocabulary drawn from the text of the Gospels, because most of our time reading Greek, most of our interest, especially with biblical Greek, is going to be spent in the New Testament. So learning the vocabulary of the New Testament really is the most useful thing for us to study. In Greek Reading 2, we'll get into some secular, real classical Greek. We'll read Aristotle, for example. And then in Greek Reading 3, we'll get into Greek poetry and read Homer if you choose to take the poetry route. But for Greek Reading 1, our interest is simply building a vocabulary while we study Greek grammar. Then in Greek Reading 2, we'll take Grammar 1 for granted and start building on our ability to read and translate and interpret. For this lesson and for all of Greek Reading 1, we're just going to focus on building vocabulary. So what I've provided in these expositions is the Greek word, what part of speech that Greek word is, and then the meaning of that word in English. And in parentheses, in italics, I've included St. Jerome's Latin translation of that Greek word, which is very helpful because this is basically showing us the interpretation of this Greek word by one of the doctors of the church. I don't think you can get much better interpretation than that. So we'll always use the Vulgate as our guide because the Vulgate was St. Jerome's interpretation of the Greek text. So we'll always keep that in view to help guide our translation and study of the Greek. So let's get started here. First, the preposition en is followed by the dative case. And again, you're not expected to know Greek grammar, but you'll understand as you get further in your grammar studies that we have the preposition en followed by a substantive noun. And with that iota subscript at the end, it's in the dative case. So that's what it means when I include that after identifying a word as a preposition. It's followed by the dative case, and the English translation of that word is in. The second word here, arche is a substantive noun, and it means the beginning. It's translated principio in the Vulgate. It means beginning. So en arche means in the beginning. Notice again that in English we add the article the, and we'll put that in parentheses because it's not in the Greek text. It simply says en arche, in beginning. We then see the verb ein, which is translated erat by St. Jerome and means was. So en arche, in the beginning, ein, was, ho logos. Ho is a definite article. There is no definite article in Latin, so you'll see there's nothing here from the Latin translation. But in English, we do use articles, and the Greek article ho is equivalent to our word the. And then we have the substantive logos. It's a substantive noun. In Latin, it's translated verbum. In English, it's word. So we have ho logos, the word. En arche, ein, ho logos. In the beginning was the word. We next have the conjunction kai, and we see that kai is translated with et in Latin, and it means and in English. So we have in the beginning was the word, and we have hologos repeated, and the word, ein, we have the verb repeated, was, and then we have pros. Pros we see as a preposition, and it's translated as with in English. In Latin, it was translated apud. So pros, we have a preposition that introduces a prepositional phrase. So pros ton theon is a prepositional phrase. The preposition pros here takes the accusative case, so we'll see ton theon in the accusative case. Ton is the definite article. It's another form of the definite article we see here as ho, so it's going to translate as the, literally. And then theon is a substantive. You can see it down here, a substantive noun that translates as deum in Latin or God in English. So kai hologos ein pros ton theon means literally, and the word was with the God. Now, in an English translation, you may not see the article translated because since we're monotheists, we don't feel a need to include the article when we refer to God. It's a proper noun. We only use it with reference to the one true God, the creator of the world. So in English translation, you normally won't see that article brought into the English. The last phrase reads kai theos ein hologos, and we don't need any new vocabulary help here. The only difference is that in the previous phrase, we have theon in the accusative case, and here we have theos in the nominative case. Kai is the conjunction and, which we saw before. Theos means God. Notice no article this time. Kai theos. Ein is the verb was. It's the third time we've seen that in this first verse. And then ho logos is the article and the substantive noun word, logos. So for verse 1, enarche ein hologos, kai hologos ein pros ton theon, kai theos ein hologos. In the beginning was the word, and the word was with the God. Again, we don't include that in the English translation. And God was the Word. Now, one note on this verse, if you look in an English Bible, an English translation, you'll notice that this last phrase is translated, and the Word was God. But in the original language, we actually see the word order is different. It says, and God was the Word. The reason why the word order is changed in English translation is because the subject of this first verse, the subject of this sentence is actually ho logos. So even in this last phrase, in the translation, ho logos is kept as the subject of the verb. So that's all for verse 1. Let's go on to verse 2. Let's practice reading this clearly. We start out with a diphthong, omicron, upsilon. Notice the two vowels at the beginning of the word, and the accent mark and the breathing mark are over the second vowel. That's because these two vowels form a diphthong, and they're treated as one vowel. They're treated together as a single vowel sound. So we see the rough breathing mark above the upsilon. So that means we're basically going to put an English letter H at the beginning of this syllable. And we see the circumflex accent, which means we're going to read this syllable with a rise and fall on that syllable. We then have tau, omicron, and final sigma. So we're going to read this as hu, tos, tos. We then have the verb ein again, which we saw several times in verse 1, means was. Hutos, sorry, I didn't give the meaning. Hutos is translated as hoc in Latin, which means this. Hutos, this. And hutos refers back to hologos, the subject of the first verse. Hutos, this. Ein was, en arche, we've already seen that phrase in verse 1. En arche means in the beginning. This was in the beginning, pros ton theon. We saw that phrase also in the first verse. Pros ton theon, which we translated as with God. This, that is hologos, ein was, en arche, in the beginning, pros ton theon, with God. That's verse 2. Verse 3, panta, see the P alpha nu tau alpha, panta. Panta here is translated omnia and means all or everything. Panta, everything. We then see delta, and that letter delta may be a little confusing because the way it's written, you might confuse that with a zeta, but that's a delta there. Delta, iota, and then you'll see an apostrophe. This is not a breathing mark. This is an apostrophe. It's marking the omission of the letter alpha at the end of this word. This word is actually dia, if you look it up in a Greek lexicon, dia, but the alpha has been dropped from pronunciation and marked with an apostrophe because the next word starts with the ah sound. So rather than saying dia autu, we just drop that alpha and combine these to say diautu. And I'll explain that more in a minute. So panta, everything, dia. We see dia here is a preposition. In Latin, it's translated as per, and it means through. In Latin, per, the preposition, takes the accusative case. But here in Greek, this preposition dia takes the genitive case. So when you learn grammar, you'll see that autu is in the genitive case because dia takes the genitive case. Autu, and again, notice we have alpha, upsilon, two vowels at the beginning of the word with the breathing mark over the second vowel. That confirms for us that this is a diphthong, one of the Greek diphthongs, and it's read as au, au, no breathing, au. We then have tau, and then we have the diphthong omicron upsilon, which is read with a circumflex accent. Au, tu, au, tu. Panta, diautu, panta, diautu. Autu is a pronoun translated as ipsum in Latin, but can be translated him in English. So panta, everything, diautu, through him, egeneto, egeneto, epsilon, gamma, epsilon, nu, epsilon, tau, omicron. Notice the soft breathing over the first epsilon and the acute accent mark on the second epsilon. Egeneto, egeneto. In the exposition, we see that egeneto is a verb, and that one word, this is significant, that one word in Greek, St. Jerome translated with two Latin words. This is called periphrasis in translation, where there's really no Latin word that exactly translates this Greek verb, so St. Jerome has to use what's called periphrasis to express the perfect passive form in Latin. So facta sunt in Latin means made are. because in Latin, again, this is omnia, which means all things. It's plural, and the verb is plural. In Greek, egeneto, egeneto here is translated as is made, being singular. That's why I translated panta as everything rather than all things. So, panta diautu egeneto, all things or everything through him is made. All things through him is made. That's a challenging phrase there. We then have the conjunction kai again, which we've seen several times. Kai, and. Then we have choris, choris, chi, omega, rho, iota, and final sigma. Choris, choris. Choris is a preposition. We see it down here. A preposition equivalent to the Latin sine. Sine takes the ablative case in Latin, but choris takes the genitive case in Greek. So we have choris autou, just as we had diautou here, we have choris autou. So choris means without, autou means him. We've already seen that. And without him, egeneto is made. Egeneto, second time we've seen that, is made. Then we've got a tricky little phrase here. In Latin, we have the word nihil. We have one word, nihil. Nihil is used to translate two Greek words here. You can see I put them on the same line. Ude, ude, which is an adverb that means not, and hen. Be careful here because there's a rough breathing over the epsilon, and there's also an acute accent mark there. Hen, ude, hen. The word ude, as I said, means not, and hen is the Greek word for one. So the Latin word nihil is St. Jerome's translation of the phrase ude hen, which means not one, or none, nothing. Not one thing. So ude hen is what St. Jerome translated as nihil. We then have ho. Now this is very confusing for beginners. We have ho, and you say, oh yeah, we've seen that before. Back up here in verse 1, we saw ho logos. Ho logos again. Ho logos. So we've seen this before, but I want you to look very carefully. We said that this was the definite article back in verse 1, and you see a rough breathing mark over that omicron. This is the definite article translated the or the. Down here in verse 3, if you look carefully, you'll see something is different. It's an omicron, and there's a rough breathing mark, but there's also a grave accent mark. And that accent mark there tells us that this is not a definite article. This is actually a pronoun. This is a pronoun. As you see down here in the exposition, ho with the accent is the pronoun which is translated as quod in Latin. So this ho and this ho, back in verse 1, are two different words. This is the definite article. This is a preposition. Now that's some annoying, tricky stuff for beginners, but you'll get used to it over time. And you'll learn that in Greek grammar. So ho, which, and then we have gegonen, gegonen, which is a verb that translates as has been made. So you can see there's a relation between gegonen and egeneto, egeneto and gegonen. Gegonen will translate as has been made. So to read that verse, this is a challenging verse, verse 3. Panta diautu egeneto, kai choris autu egeneto ude hen ho gegonen. Everything through him was made or is made, and without him is made not one thing which has been made. Panta diautu egeneto, kai choris autu egeneto, ude hen ho gegonen. That's verse 3. Verse 4, we have epsilon with no breathing or soft breathing followed by nu. This is the preposition en again, which we've now seen several times. We said before that en is followed by the dative case. Here we see en followed by the dative case. In the first verse, we saw en followed by the dative case. We see that again here in verse 4. We see en followed by the dative case. Auto, we have the diphthong alpha upsilon with a soft breathing. Auto, circumflex accent there, and iota subscript. Auto, in him. We see auto was translated ipso in Latin. En auto, in him, zoe. Zoe. Here we have the zeta. I said before you need to be careful to note the difference between the zeta and the delta when you're getting started. You can see up here, or right here actually, there's a delta. There's the delta, and here is the zeta. So make sure you keep those two consonants clear in your mind as you read. This is equivalent to the Latin zeta or English z. We have the omega, the long or great O, and then we have an eta with grave accent. So we have zoe, 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 and try to lengthen that O sound when you read the omega. Zoe, en auto, zoe, in him, zoe. Vita in Latin or life in English, substantive noun. Zoe. It's where we get the word animal from, or living creature. The study of zoology is the study of living creatures. That comes from this Greek word zoe, which means life. So en auto zoe ein. In him life was. That's the verb again we've seen before. We then have the conjunction kai, or et, or and again, kai, and. We then have he. He here is a definite article. So we've seen the masculine definite article back in verse 1. This is the masculine definite article, ho. Now in verse 4, we see the feminine definite article, he. He. So this again is the definite article translated the or the. And the zoe. We've already seen zoe, life, and the life. Then we have the verb ein again, was, ta. This is the neuter definite article. The neuter definite article. So we've seen the masculine, the feminine, and now the neuter definite article. And the life was the phos. Phos. We see down in the exposition, phos is a substantive noun. That's the word translated lux in the Vulgate and light in English. Phos. If you think of the English word photo or photography, it's derived from this Greek word phos, which speaks of light. So, and the life was the light ton. This is another form of the definite article. This is a genitive plural form of the masculine definite article. Ton, of the, and then we have the word anthropon. Anthropon. We have alpha with soft breathing, followed by nu, followed by theta, then rho, then omega with an acute accent, then p, omega, and nu. Anthropon, anthropon. And this is the word for man. But because this is genitive plural, it's translated of men. In Latin, we saw hominum. Hominum was translated of men. It's plural. And so we see that in the English here. And the life was the light of the men. That's a literal translation of what's there in the Greek. En auto zoe ein, kai hezoe ein tophos ton anthropon. In him life was, and the life was the light of the men. Anthropon. If you think of the English word anthropology, it means the study of man or the science of human nature. If you think of anthropomorphism, means having the form of man. Anthropos is the Greek word for man. That's verse 4. Verse 5. Kai, we have the conjunction again, kappa, and the diphthong alpha iota. Kai, to, we then have the neuter definite article again. Tophos, and the light. En is the preposition followed by the dative case. See those iota subscripts marking the dative case. En te, this is the feminine definite article. It's the dative case of the feminine definite article. En te, in the, scotia. Down in the exposition, we see scotia is a substantive noun, translated tenebris in Latin, which means darkness. Kai tophos, and the light, en te scotia, in the darkness. And then we have phi, alpha iota, diphthong, nu, epsilon iota, diphthong. Phaine. Kai tophos en te scotia phaine, and the light in the darkness phaine. In Latin, it's lucet. In English, shines, the verb shines. And the light in the darkness shines. Kai, the conjunction and, he scotia. So here we saw te scotia, because this was in the dative case. We have the dative case of the definite article. Here we see the nominative case of the definite article. And the scotia, darkness. Auto. This is a pronoun. In Latin, it's translated eam. It's feminine because in Latin, lux is feminine, and eam refers back to lux. So in Latin, we had the feminine pronoun. Here in Greek, we have a neuter pronoun, auto, which means it, because in Greek, phos is neuter. We saw the neuter definite article. So we have auto, the neuter pronoun, referring back to phos, the light, translated it. And the darkness, it. We have the diphthong omicron upsilon. Omicron upsilon, diphthong. Notice again, the breathing mark is over the second vowel because these two vowels are treated as one vowel sound because they're a diphthong. We have which is the adverb translated non in Latin, meaning not in English. And the darkness, it, that is the light. Not, katellaben. We have kappa, alpha, tau, epsilon with an acute accent, lambda, alpha, beta, epsilon, nu. Katellaben. We see that's a verb translated comprehenderunt in Latin, comprehenderunt, which means did comprehend, past tense, did comprehend. So reading that, we have kai tophos en te scotia phaine, kai he scotia auto u catelaben, and the light in the darkness shines, and the darkness it not did comprehend. And in Latin reading, we talked about the meaning of this verb. We talked about the idea of comprehending. We can think that when we speak about learning, we say, does he comprehend the lesson? And that's equivalent to the idea of understanding. But the actual word comprehend has to do with taking hold of, literally taking hold of. So when we say we comprehend something in learning, we're using the word comprehend in a figurative way, like mentally we take hold of an idea, but it's got a more literal meaning, which means to take hold of. So the translation here, comprehenderunt, or did comprehend, we're not committing to one of those meanings. We're simply translating this and leaving that open for interpretation because, as I've said before in Latin reading, these language courses are not the proper place for discussions of interpretation. What does this verse actually mean? The goal in Greek reading, like Latin reading, is to simply know what the language says and what the possible translations might be, what possible interpretations might exist. So that's our goal. So we're not going to get into the meaning of that word, just identify this verb, kateleben, as meaning did comprehend or comprehenderunt in Latin. So we have kaitofos, and the light in the darkness shines, and the darkness it not did comprehend. And that's the end of verse 5. And that brings us to the end of these 5 verses. Now here, I've written out an English translation, and notice this little note says, the following is a literal translation based on the expositions above. So this is not the English translation taken from an English Catholic Bible. This is just a summary of the literal translations of the expositions we've done in this lesson. And what's interesting is if you take this, seeing where this translation has come from, and compare it to an English Catholic Bible. See where they agree and see where they may disagree, and make notes of that and ask yourself, why does the translation in the English Bible not follow exactly this literal translation? And you'll see that the translators, approved by the Church, have made some judgment with respect to interpretation. They've made some interpretations to come up with the English translation that's actually published in the Catholic Bible. And those points are actually very significant and worth giving your attention to. So we've translated all of verses 1 through 5 here, and I've taken a very great amount of time to look at the letters and the breathing marks and the accent marks to make sure pronunciation is clear, to make sure you're noticing all of these little details of the language to help you with your grammar studies. But remember, in Greek reading, really all we're concerned with is building our vocabulary. So just making sure that you can identify the English meaning of the Greek words, that's really what you're going to be asked to do on the lesson assessments. One final thing I want to discuss before we end this video is the need for you to complete translation exercises to master these lessons. These translation exercises are very important. The use of translation exercises is a very ancient method of language study. It's actually how Cicero studied Greek and advised others to study Greek. It's how medieval schoolmasters taught their students to learn Greek and Latin languages by translation exercises. And it's a very important practice when you're learning these languages. What you need to do to complete these translation exercises, and if you click this link, I believe it has instructions and examples. But what you're basically going to do is copy the Greek text. You can copy it into a document by literally copying the the text and pasting it or typing it, which I don't recommend, or doing it by hand. And what I would recommend as you get started with Greek is that you do your Greek work by hand on notepaper, because it's relatively easy to draw the Greek letters. It's very time consuming to type them, and I wouldn't recommend it. I would recommend you do it by hand in writing. Much easier. Sort of enjoyable to practice writing in Greek. But copy the text in large print, whatever you can fit on one line, and then skip a line and continue copying the text. Copy out all the text, and then go back and for each Greek word, under that word on the empty line, write the English meaning of that Greek word. So for N, you would under it write in. Then for arche, under it, you would write the beginning and put the in parentheses. Then for ein, you would write was. For ho, you would write the. For logos, you would write word. And move like that, one word at a time, translating the Greek word into English, showing that you understand the meaning of every Greek word. Now, when you get started, you're going to have to look at your lesson for help. So copy out the Greek text, and then look to your lesson and learn the meanings of each Greek word and write them in your translation exercise. And go through all 5 verses like that until you've written the translation for every Greek word. Then do it again. You don't have to do it at the same time. You can do it on another day, but do the same exercise again. Copy out the Greek and write the English translation word for word. Try to do it from memory. See how much you can write from memory, and then look up whatever you don't remember. And do it again and again, and continue that translation exercise until you can copy out the Greek text and write the English translation word for word without looking at your lesson, without looking at a dictionary, without looking at your lesson, without asking anyone for help. When you can write the word for word translation without any help, that's when you should say, I've finished the translation exercise. Now, when you finish that, when you finish the Greek to English translation exercise, you should do it in the other direction. You should now write out the English translation, and you can get that from the bottom of this page. Copy out the English translation in the same way, skipping a line after each line of English text, and then look at the English word and write the Greek word below it. In, en, beginning, arche, was, ein, the, ho, word, logos, and so on. And write out the Greek to English, the English to Greek translation. And do the same thing. Do it until you can do it without looking at your lesson for any help with the vocabulary. And when you can copy out the Latin, not from memory, English. Write out the English, not from memory, just using the text, copy out the English, then write out the Greek translation for every word. When you can do that, then you should say you're finished with the English to Greek translation exercise. And if you take my advice and practice those translation exercises, you will thoroughly master these lessons. Now, the real benefit of studying to that level of mastery is that much of this vocabulary is going to be repeated in future lessons. So the more time that you spend mastering this early New Testament vocabulary, the easier your future lessons and future readings in New Testament Greek will be. So it's time well spent. And you should do that to master these Greek reading lessons. So that's how I intend for you to study these lessons. Now, I know many students are not going to listen. They're going to cut corners. They're going to skip those translation exercises. They're going to write it out one time and submit it and pretend that it's a final copy. They're going to go to the quiz, take the quiz, look up the answers in the lesson, type the answers in the quiz, and just cheat their way through. And there's nothing that I can do about that. And frankly, I don't care. If a student chooses to cheat himself of the opportunity to learn, he's not a real student. And he's going to be exposed when we get to Greek 2, and he's unable to read because we're not going to wait for him. So take my advice, study the right way, make learning the language your goal, follow the instructions, and study for mastery, and you'll benefit in the future. So that's all that I'd like to say for this first lesson in Greek reading. It's a lot of content, a lot to study and learn. So I'd like you to get to work now, study this lesson for mastery. You can use this video as often as you like. You can play back different parts, pause it, rewind it, listen to things over again. Use the video. You're in control of the video lesson, but study this lesson for yourself, master this vocabulary, and we'll continue our study of Greek reading when we get into verses 6 through 10 in our next lesson. If there's anything that after studying you don't understand or you'd like clarified, you can either post on the forum on the Greek reading course page or send me an email anytime. I'd be happy to help you. But do the work of a student, work to learn this content, master this content, and you'll really be reading Greek in no time, especially if you're working on grammar at the same time. So I hope that's helpful. God bless your studies.